Picture this. A cowboy sits by a crackling fire. The sky is full of stars. He's got a tin plate loaded with beans, a thick slab of steak, maybe some cornbread on the side. He tips his hat, takes a slow, satisfied bite. That's the version Hollywood gave you. That's the version that sold 1 million westerns. And it is almost entirely fiction. The real frontier cowboy? He was hungry. He was sick. He smelled like death. And the food he ate, if you could even call it food, was enough to make a modern person gag just reading about it. We're talking about hardened biscuits crawling with insects, meat so salty it burned your throat, coffee brewed in water that animals had been standing in. This isn't a history lesson, this is a survival horror story. And it happened every single day on the American frontier. So let's pull back the curtain. Let's talk about what cowboys actually ate, and why it was so much worse than anything you've ever imagined. Let's start with the staple, the one food that showed up everywhere. On cattle drives, in army rations, in the saddlebags of every man crossing the plains. It was called hardtack, and the name is not an exaggeration. Hardtack was a simple cracker made from flour, water, and salt. That's it. No yeast, no butter, no flavor. It was baked, sometimes twice, until every last drop of moisture was gone. The result was a dense, pale, rock-hard square of compressed misery. You couldn't bite into it, not directly. Men would soak it in water first, or coffee, or whatever liquid they had on hand. And even then, it had the texture of wet cardboard. But here's where it gets worse, much worse. Hardtack didn't stay clean. It couldn't. Out on the trail in canvas bags and wooden crates in the damp heat of a chuck wagon, hardtack became a home, a breeding ground for weevils. Weevils are small beetles, tiny, dark, almost invisible if you're not looking. And they loved hardtack. They burrowed inside it, laid their eggs inside it, and by the time a cowboy pulled a biscuit from his bag, it was often riddled with larvae. Little white worms curled up inside the cracks. Some men would tap the hardtack against their knee before eating, knock the weevils loose, watch them fall to the ground, then eat what was left. Other men didn't bother. They ate in the dark, on purpose, because if you couldn't see the worms, you could pretend they weren't there. There's a grim joke that circulated among soldiers and cowboys alike. The hardtack isn't moving, the weevils are. And the smell. Old hardtack had a musty, stale odor, like wet flour left in a basement for a month, mixed with the faint, sour tang of insect activity. It wasn't just unpleasant. It was a warning sign your body recognized instinctively. Don't eat this. But on the frontier, you didn't have a choice. You ate it, or you starved. And sometimes, even after eating it, you felt like you were starving anyway. Because hardtack had almost no nutritional value beyond raw calories. It kept you alive. Barely. It didn't keep you healthy. Nothing on the frontier kept you healthy. If hardtack was the foundation of a cowboy's diet, meat was the dream. The thing men talked about around the fire, the thing they fantasized about after weeks on the trail. But the reality of frontier meat was a long way from a sizzling steak. Let's talk about salt pork first. Salt pork was exactly what it sounds like. Pork, usually the belly or the fatback, packed in so much salt it could survive for months without refrigeration. It was cheap, it was available, and it was absolutely foul. The salt didn't just preserve the meat, it transformed it. The flesh turned pale, almost gray. The fat went yellow and waxy. The texture became rubbery and dense, and the smell, God, the smell. Rancid fat mixed with brine, a sharp, sour, almost chemical odor that hit you before you even opened the barrel. Before cooking it, men had to soak salt pork in water for hours, sometimes overnight, just to pull some of the salt out, make it edible. But even after soaking, it was still aggressively salty, still tough, still tasting like something that had been sitting in a barrel since before the Civil War. Because sometimes it had been. Supply chains on the frontier were unreliable at best, non-existent at worst. Salt pork that was supposed to last 6 months sometimes had to last a year or 2. By that point, the fat had gone fully rancid. The meat had taken on a greenish tinge in places. And the brine at the bottom of the barrel was a thick, murky, brownish liquid that smelled like a slaughterhouse floor. Men ate it anyway. They fried it in its own grease, mixed it into beans, chewed through it with grim determination. Because the alternative was nothing. Then there was jerky, dried, preserved meat. In theory, a perfect trail food, lightweight, long-lasting, portable. In practice, a nightmare. Frontier jerky wasn't the soft, flavored, vacuum-sealed product you find at a gas station today. It was strips of meat, beef, buffalo, sometimes horse, dried in the open air. Under the sun, in the wind, exposed to flies, exposed to dust, exposed to everything the frontier had to offer. The drying process turned the meat black, hard as leather, literally the same texture as a boot sole. Men would gnaw on a strip of jerky for 20 minutes and barely make a dent. Their jaws ached, their teeth hurt, and the taste was intensely gamey, bitter, with a faint underlying note of rot if the drying hadn't gone perfectly, which it often hadn't. Improperly dried jerky would develop mold on the surface, a white or green fuzz that men would scrape off with a knife, then eat the rest, because again, the alternative was nothing. And if you were lucky enough to shoot fresh game on the trail, a rabbit, a prairie dog, a rattlesnake, you ate it immediately. You didn't waste a single piece. You ate the organs. You cracked the bones for marrow. You boiled the scraps into a thin, gray broth that tasted like dirty water with a hint of meat. And you were grateful, because at least it was fresh. At least it wasn't moving.
If there was one thing cowboys clung to, one ritual that gave them something resembling comfort, it was coffee, and even that was a disaster. Coffee on the frontier was nothing like what you're drinking right now. It wasn't ground fresh, it wasn't filtered, it wasn't brewed with clean water. It was made by tossing a handful of coarse ground beans, or sometimes whole beans crushed with a rifle butt, into a tin pot, filling that pot with whatever water was available, and boiling it over an open fire until it turned black. The result was thick, gritty, bitter enough to make your eyes water. The ground settled at the bottom of the cup, but never completely. Every sip came with a mouthful of fine, sandy sediment. You chewed your coffee on the frontier. That was just how it was. But the water. Let's talk about the water. On a good day, cowboys had access to a river or a stream. On a bad day, they had a muddy creek. On a terrible day, they had a stagnant pool. The kind of pool where cattle had been standing, where horses had been drinking, where the ground around the edges was churned into a brown, foul-smelling mud. That water went into the coffee pot. Boiling killed some of the bacteria, not all of it, and it did nothing for the taste. Frontier coffee made with bad water had a flat, earthy, almost fecal undertone, a sourness that sat at the back of your throat. Men drank it anyway, because caffeine was one of the only stimulants available, and because the alternative was drinking the water straight, which was even worse. Some outfits stretched their coffee supply by mixing in other substances. Roasted grain, usually barley or rye, ground up and added to the pot, chicory root if they could find it. Dried acorns in desperate times. These substitutes added bulk. They did not add flavor. They made the coffee taste like burnt wood mixed with dirt. But it was hot, and it was bitter. And on a cold morning on the open plains with nothing but hardtack and salt pork ahead of you, hot and bitter was enough. It had to be.
In 1866, a Texas rancher named Charles Goodnight built the first chuck wagon, a mobile kitchen on wheels, designed to feed cowboys on long cattle drives. It was, in theory, a brilliant innovation. In practice, it was a rolling petri dish. The chuck wagon carried everything: flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, dried fruit, cooking equipment, and the man in charge of all of it was called Cookie, the camp cook, the most important and most feared man on any cattle drive. Cookie was not a trained chef. He was usually an older cowboy, too broken down to ride, too stubborn to quit. He cooked for 10, 15, sometimes 20 men, 3 times a day, in the open air, in the wind and the dust and the rain, with no running water, no refrigeration, no sanitation of any kind. The same hands that handled raw salt pork handled the flour for the biscuits. The same pot that boiled beans was rinsed, not washed, rinsed, and used for coffee. The cutting board, if there was one, was never properly cleaned. It was wiped down with a rag that was also used to wipe sweat, to clean the serving ladle, to wipe the lid of the grease can. Flies were everywhere. They landed on the food constantly. Cookie would wave them away. They would come back. He would wave them away again. Eventually, he stopped bothering. The men ate food that had been sitting in the open air for hours, covered in a thin layer of trail dust, visited by every insect within a quarter mile. And if a cowboy complained, if he said the beans were undercooked, or the biscuits were burnt, or the coffee tasted like mud, Cookie had the right, the unwritten right, to make his life miserable. Bad food for the rest of the drive, smaller portions, the worst cuts of everything. So men ate in silence. They choked down whatever was put in front of them, and they said thank you, because Cookie was the law of the camp, and the food, as bad as it was all there was. The most common meal from the chuck wagon was something called son of a bitch stew. That's the actual name. It was made from the organs of a freshly slaughtered calf. Heart, liver, kidneys, tongue, sometimes the brain. Everything that couldn't be preserved or sold, thrown into a pot with water, onions if available, and whatever spices Cookie had on hand. Boiled until it was thick and gray. The smell was intense, metallic and gamey and deeply animal. The texture was soft in some places, rubbery in others. Men ate it without complaint, because it was hot, because it was protein, because on the frontier you didn't waste anything, not a single piece. Food could make you sick on the frontier, but water could kill you, and it did, constantly. The American frontier had no municipal water systems, no wells in most places, no filtration, no treatment. Cowboys drank from rivers, streams, creeks, and ponds, whatever they could find. And those water sources were shared with cattle, with horses, with buffalo, with every wild animal on the plains. The water downstream from a cattle crossing was thick with waste. Bacteria from animal feces contaminated entire stretches of river. Men drank it. They had no choice. The result was dysentery, constant, brutal, debilitating dysentery, stomach cramps that doubled men over, diarrhea so severe it caused dangerous dehydration. In a cruel irony, the more water you drank, the sicker you got. And the sicker you got, the more water you needed. It was a death spiral. Men died from it regularly, not dramatically, not with a bang. They just got weaker and weaker, and one morning they didn't get up. But dysentery wasn't the only disease stalking the frontier. There was also scurvy. Scurvy is what happens when your body runs out of vitamin C, and on a diet of hardtack, salt pork, and coffee. Vitamin C was essentially non-existent. The symptoms started slowly: fatigue, irritability, gums that bled when you pressed them. Then the gums started to swell. Teeth became loose. Old wounds, wounds that had healed years ago, reopened. The body literally started to fall apart. In advanced cases, men's legs swelled to twice their normal size. Their skin turned yellow. They couldn't walk, couldn't ride, couldn't work. And they died from not eating vegetables, from not eating fruit, from a diet so stripped of nutrition that the human body simply gave out. The frontier didn't just starve men of calories, it starved them of everything their bodies needed to function. And the land, vast, beautiful, brutal, didn't care. It never cared. After weeks on the trail, after hardtack and salt pork and foul water and weevils and dust, a cowboy would finally reach a town, Dodge City, Abilene, Tombstone. And for a brief, glorious moment, the world opened up. Sort of. Eggs were available in frontier towns. Real eggs from actual chickens, and they were expensive, absurdly expensive by the standards of the time. A single egg could cost what a working man earned in half a day. Cowboys would spend money they didn't have on eggs, fried in a pan with real butter. The taste was almost overwhelming after weeks of nothing. Rich, fatty, warm. Men would close their eyes while they ate, just to focus on the sensation. Canned fruit was another luxury. Peaches, pears, cherries, packed in heavy syrup in tin cans. But here's the thing about those cans. The canning technology of the 1800s was primitive, unreliable. Cans were sealed with lead solder, and that lead leached into the food, slowly, invisibly. Men who ate a lot of canned goods over time developed symptoms of lead poisoning. Headaches, confusion, tremors. They didn't know why. They didn't connect it to the food. They just thought they were tired, or getting old, or going a little crazy from too much time on the plains. Which was also possible. Whiskey was the other luxury. Cheap, rough, barely filtered frontier whiskey. It tasted like turpentine mixed with regret. But it was alcohol. And alcohol numbed things. The hunger, the exhaustion, the memory of what you'd been eating for the past 2 months. Men drank until they couldn't feel the trail anymore. And then they went back to it. Because the cattle didn't wait, the drive didn't stop, and the hardtack was already packed. So there you have it, the disgusting, unglamorous, stomach-turning truth about what cowboys actually ate on the American frontier. Weevil-infested hardtack, rancid salt pork, coffee brewed in water that cattle had been standing in, organ stew with a name I can't repeat on this channel, and a slow, creeping death from diseases caused by eating almost nothing of nutritional value for months at a time. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Which one of these foods do you think was the absolute worst? The hardtack with the live weevils? The gray, rubbery salt pork? The coffee that tasted like mud and animal waste? Or the son of a bitch stew? Let me know. And if you made it this far without losing your appetite entirely, respect. Hit that subscribe button because we've got a lot more of this coming. Next week, we're going inside the Frontier Saloon. And trust me, the drinks were just as bad as the food. See you then.